Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Duke Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative and a conversation this afternoon with Peter Thiel. Peter obviously needs very little or no introduction, but since it's customary to do that, I'll do it. Peter is an entrepreneur and an inventor, obviously. Got really going, started with the development of PayPal, originally as an alternative currency, but now as a completely ubiquitous form of making payments. A remarkable group of people there. We know the PayPal mafia, Elon Musk and others, SpaceX, LinkedIn, YouTube, many, many things. 2004, Peter started Planeteer Technologies, a data analytics company that's focused on both national security and on global finance, continues to be very successful. That same year, 2004, he was one of the first investors in Facebook, and that obviously needs no further comment on how successful that's been. And today, Peter is also a venture capitalist through his own founders fund. He started the Thiel Foundation, 20 under 20, looking for people and encouraging them to step away from college and start their own career, and to do an interesting experiment that focused on the differences that might exist between learning and schooling. Peter taught a very successful course at Stanford University. The notes for that course became sort of viral and have recently been published as a book, From Zero to One. And I'd just like to point out that Peter will be available to sign books. We'll have a book signing at the conclusion of the event. So Peter has some prepared remarks that he'll make. We'll then have sort of a conversation with Peter, and we'll be taking questions. So with that, I welcome to the podium Peter Thiel.
Thank you very much. There are many different things we could talk about today, but one of the tremendous challenges in teaching about entrepreneurship or writing a book about entrepreneurship is that there's a sense in which there's no precise science of this. Science involves, science starts with the number 2. It involves things that you can repeat, experiments you can repeat. But I believe that every moment in the history of business, in the history of technology, happens only once. The next Mark Zuckerberg will not be starting a social networking site. The next Larry Page will not be starting a search engine. The next Bill Gates will not be starting an operating system company. And so if you're trying to imitate these people or turn them into some sort of a formula for success, there's some sense in which you're not learning from them at all. And so this is sort of the challenge that I start with, because I think it's always one of the things that's very tricky about teaching entrepreneurship, writing about it, because it has this sense where there definitely are certain things you can do right, certain processes you can follow, but the key element is always unique, special, and very, very differentiated. And so I try to get at this question a little bit more indirectly through a set of indirect questions. The indirect business question is something like, what great business is nobody starting? The more indirect intellectual question, which I've found to be a terrific interview question, is tell me something that's true that very few people agree with you on. And this is actually, even when people can read on the internet that you're going to ask this question of everybody who comes in the door, it's one of those questions that still remains very hard for people to answer, because there's always, and I think it's not just because people think, oh, you have to have some really brilliant answer to have some truth that hasn't been discovered, but it's also quite a sociologically, psychologically awkward question to answer, because a good answer is one the person asking you won't agree with. If they agree with it, if you have some sort of very conventional answer like the education system doesn't work or the political system doesn't work, that everybody agrees with you on, those are uninteresting answers. They're ones that are already, these are conventions that people agree with you on. Good answers are ones that are uncomfortable, that people will not agree with you on. I think we live in a world in which courage is in much shorter supply than genius. So I want to maybe offer just a few of the answers I have to this question today, things that I believe to be true that most people do not agree with me on, and that I found to be very helpful in thinking about business entrepreneurship in one way or another. And I think perhaps the the first idea, and this is perhaps the sort of single fixed obsessive idea of the whole 0 to 1 book, is that most people think that capitalism and competition are synonyms, and I believe they are antonyms. I believe that a capitalist is someone who's in the business of accumulating capital, whereas a world of perfect competition is a world in which all the profits are competed away. And if you want to compete like crazy, you should open a restaurant. You will never make any money doing so. It's a very, very bad business idea almost uniformly. But if you really just want to compete, that's what you should do. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you want to have a successful business, you want to be doing something that's so differentiated that nobody else in the world is doing it. And in a word, you want to have a monopoly. And we can have all sorts of interesting debates about when monopolies are good or bad from the point of view of society as a whole. But from the inside, as a founder, as an entrepreneur, as an early investor, as an early employee, you always want to aim for a monopoly. And the paradigm example I give in my book is Google, which has had a fantastic monopoly in search for something like 13 years, since about 2002, when Google definitively distanced itself from Yahoo and Microsoft. Now this sort of idea that there are, to first approximation, just two kinds of businesses, successful ones that are monopolies and unsuccessful ones that are in hyper-competition, I think is very poorly understood. There's sort of an intellectual reason we fail to understand it, and it's basically because the people who have monopolies don't talk about it, and the people who are competing like crazy also understate the ferocity of the competition. And so the apparent difference ends up being much smaller than the real business. So, if you were to leave today's talk and say, I'm more determined than ever to open a restaurant here in the Research Triangle area in North Carolina, you'd quickly run into trouble. People say, I don't want to give you any money. This is a bad business idea. They always mostly go out of business. None of them ever make money. And then you'd say, well, but it's going to be really different from other restaurants. This one's going to be, a British Nepalese fusion cuisine. It'll be the only one within a 5-mile distance of the Duke University campus. And so you can tell a fictional story about a differentiated market that obscures the reality that it's just a restaurant and is going to be competing like crazy with all sorts of other restaurants. And then conversely, if you have a crazy monopoly like Google, you will not want to talk about the market you're in, namely search, which is something Google has barely alluded to in the last 5-6 years. And you will instead try to redefine yourself as a technology company, which is this much more amorphous, vastly bigger space where there's competition everywhere, and you're competing with Apple with the Android phone, and you're competing with the self-driving car. You'll be competing with all the car companies in the U.S., and you're competing with Facebook and Amazon, and no, you're not the monopoly that the government is looking for. And so because of this systematic distortion, it ends up being, I think, this very poorly understood idea. But I think there's sort of a second reason, which is a little bit more psychological in nature, that I want to maybe develop a little bit as well. The opening line of Anna Karenina is that all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. And I sort of want to suggest that the opposite is true of business, that all happy companies are different because they found something unique to do. All unhappy companies are alike because they fail to escape the essential sameness that is competition. When the Wall Street Journal excerpted my chapter entitled All Happy Companies Are Different, they thought we need a slightly more punchy title for this, and so we need to amp it up a little bit more. And so they retitled it as Competition is for Losers, which has a certain punchy feel to it. And it's very punchy because we always believe the exact opposite. We believe that the losers are the people who aren't competing well enough. The losers are the people whose grades aren't quite good enough to get into the right university or the right grad school, or who are a little bit too slow on the swim team or the track team to make it. We never think of the losers as the people who are somehow perversely attracted to competition and are therefore competing in a sort of totally insane way. The somewhat autobiographical version of this was, I grew up in Northern California, super tracked. In my 8th grade junior high school yearbook, one of my friends wrote in, I know that 4 years from now you're going to be going to Stanford. 4 years later, I got into Stanford. Then I got into Stanford Law School. Sort of won one competition, one track tournament after another. Ended up at a big law firm in Manhattan. And it was one of these very strange places where from the outside everybody wanted to get in, on the inside everybody wanted to get out. When I left after 7 months and 3 days, one of the people down the hall from me said, it's really reassuring to see you leave. I had no idea it was possible to escape from Alcatraz. And actually all you had to do was go out the front door and not come back. But this was extremely hard for people to do because so much of their identity was wrapped up in the competitions they had won one after the other, that it was unthinkable for people to walk away from these things. I think there's sort of an academic version of this that Henry Kissinger alluded to when he described his fellow professors at Harvard by saying, the battles in academia are so ferocious because the stakes are so small, which always sounds like a definition of insanity, because you'd think that if you're going to have a really crazy fight about something, you should be doing it over things where the stakes are really big. And so on one level, it's a description of insanity. But on another level, it's a description of the logic of a situation where if people cannot differentiate themselves from one another, the fighting gets more and more intense, even as the stakes, as the differences, as what you could possibly gain by winning, somehow gets smaller and smaller. And so I think one finds this in many, many different places, many different applications, and it's something to always be very aware of. One of the questions I often get asked are, what are some trends that I see in technology? What are things where I see it's going? I always dislike answering this question because I think I'm not a prophet. I can't really tell you what's going to happen. I could try cheating by giving you really banal answers, like saying there'll be more cell phones used in 5 years or something like that. But if I've come up with a answer in a startup context, it is anything that sounds like a trend. All trends are overrated, and the more you've heard the trend, the more overrated it is. And so in the Silicon Valley context, educational software, healthcare IT software, these are very overrated trends. SaaS, enterprise software as a service, enterprise software, very overrated. If you hear the words big data, cloud computing, you need to think fraud and run away very fast. And the reason these buzzwords they're sort of like tells in poker. If you hear a lot of buzzwords, it's like a tell that the people who are using the buzzwords are bluffing and that they don't really have a differentiated business. So it's like we're building a mobile platform for SaaS businesses to use big data in the cloud. That's sort of like the elevator pitch. You automatically get very, very nervous. And the reason you get nervous is because all of these are well-established categories. And when you have well-established categories, it tells you many other people are already doing this. And you never want to be the nth person in a category. You do not want to be the 4th online pet food company or the 10th thin film solar panel company or the 1,000th restaurant in the Research Triangle area. You want to be in a category of your own. And when you do that, you often don't have a very good narrative for it. And in fact, often we don't even have the proper terminology for these things in different ways. Now, there are all sorts of ways this sort of gets applied in different contexts. Certainly, I think there are many successful companies that got mislabeled in conventional categories. So Google was described as a search engine when there were, already had been 20 or so by the time they came along in '98. The correct way to think of it would have been machine-powered search as opposed to human-powered search. The PageRank algorithm was the key breakthrough. And if you simply labeled a search engine, you obscured and you lost sight of what was the essential difference. Facebook in 2004 was described as a social network, still gets described as a social network today. I'm not actually sure that that's the correct label either. There have been many social networking companies before Facebook. My friend Reid Hoffman, who ended up starting LinkedIn, started a company in 1997 called SocialNet. So they already had social networking in the name of the company 7 years before Facebook got started. And they had all these ideas about it would be these avatars in cyberspace, and some people would be virtual cats, and other people would be virtual dogs, and we'd have these rules for how they'd interact with each other. And it turned out people weren't really interested in networking as virtual cats and dogs. And the key thing was not about social networking in the abstract. It was about real identity, which was the problem that Facebook actually was the first one to crack. And so I think getting the narrative right, figuring out the unique differentiation on these businesses is really essential, really critical. There are many sort of strange applications of this monopoly thesis. One that I will mention is that the conventional business theory advice is you want to go after big markets. My theory would be you always want to go after big market share, and so and actually paradoxically, if you're starting a company, you get to a big share if you go after a small market. That's much easier to get a big share than if you go after a really big market. When we started PayPal, we ended up going after a very idiosyncratic slice of the payments market. It was sort of online eBay power sellers that had some very tricky payments problems. There were about 20,000 of these people, and we got from 0 to about 40% market share in 4 or 5 months. So that was a very auspicious start for the business. Facebook started with 10,000 students at Harvard. A market so small that it would never pass muster. And if you had an MBA business plan competition, we would say that's a ridiculously small market, that you get an F for market size right there. And you went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. It was sort of, again, very auspicious start, and then you sort of grew it out in concentric circles. Sort of one opposite end of the spectrum was the clean tech bubble in Silicon Valley in the 2005 to 2008 period, where I think a lot of different things went wrong, but one dimension on which it went very wrong was the markets were simply too big. And almost every PowerPoint presentation that one saw, the first slide started with, we have a giant market. It's measured in the size of hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. It's called energy. And if we have sort of a 1% share of this market, we'll still have a pretty big company. And that might be true, but it's hard to get it to be a profitable company because it's going to be so hard to differentiate. So you have to, if you're doing a thin film solar panel, you're going to have to beat the other 9 thin film solar panel companies, and then you have to beat the other 90 solar panel companies, and then you have to beat the wind companies, and then it turns out you have to beat the fracking that came out of right field and the cheap Chinese manufacturing that came out of left field, and you never want to be a minnow in a vast ocean. There's just ends up being hidden competition everywhere in all these different ways. Now, I think this, one last thought on the sort of psychological element of competition, where we're sort of always very addicted to it. There is this very strange phenomenon in Silicon Valley where it's not universal, but where a surprisingly large number of the successful founders of these companies seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's in one way or another. And I think we need to always take this fact and turn it around into a critique of our broader society. And we need to ask the question, what is it about our society where those of us who do not have Asperger's are at a disadvantage because we're going to be socially attuned to what people think around us, and we will therefore be talked out of our original, creative, interesting ideas before they're even fully formed. And so we will notice, oh, that's a little bit too strange. People are looking at me a little too funny here. I better not do that. I better not do this. Maybe I should just go back to opening that restaurant. If you sort of want the anti-Asperger's cohort, and I will apologize if I'm offending anyone in the audience here, but I think the anti-Asperger's cohort are always business school students. And you can sort of think of them as sort of extremely well-socialized people. One might say, some people might say they don't have very many convictions or principles of their own. That may be a little bit mean. But if you sort of take people like this and you put them in a hothouse environment for 2 years, where they're trying to figure out what to do with their lives, and they spend 2 years talking to other people just like themselves. And they've done these studies at Harvard Business School where they found that the largest cohort of people systematically always try to catch the last wave and always did the wrong thing. And so in '89, they all wanted to work for Michael Milken just before the junk bond thing blew up. and he went to jail. They were never really interested in tech or Silicon Valley, except for 99, 2000, when they sort of descended on Silicon Valley and timed the end of the dot-com bubble perfectly, and on and on. And I think and I don't think this is just a business school problem. I think this is actually a almost universal human problem. The word ape, already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. And there's something very deep in human nature where we learn by imitation, by copying. It's how we learn a language as children, by copying our parents. It's how culture gets transmitted in our society. But there are many ways where imitation goes badly wrong. It leads to sort of insane peer pressure dynamics. It leads to financial bubbles, the madness of crowds, insane delusions of all sorts. And so I think this idea that you should do your own thing and not copy other people is always advice that's extremely easy to give and rather difficult to follow. Let me maybe end with one slightly bigger picture perspective on something I believe to be true that most people do not agree with me on. I think that in a successful 21st century, we will need both globalization and and more technological progress. And I always like to define these things as quite different. People, I think, often use these terms interchangeably, and I think that's very misleading. I always like to draw globalization on the x-axis. It involves copying things that work, going from one to n, horizontal or extensive progress. I think China today is the paradigmatic example of globalization. The plan China has is to simply copy the things that have worked in the US, Western Europe, maybe skip a few steps here and there, but it's a very straightforward development plan. But then there's also technological innovation. We have to do new things, going from 0 to 1, vertical or intensive progress. And it's somewhat different in kind because there is sort of no set formula for doing this in one way or another. And I think even though we always get described as that we're living in a world where technology is accelerating like crazy and it's drenched with technology in one way or another, I'm actually more inclined to suggest that we live in a society in which there's not as much technological progress as advertised. There's been a lot in the world of bits, not so much in the world of atoms for the last 40 years. And we live in a culture that I think by and large is extremely hostile to all things scientific and technological. And the easiest way to see this is just to look at all the Hollywood movies. There's always sort of a challenge I give an audience is name me a single science fiction movie from the last 25 years that does not show technology in a way that's destructive, dystopian, is going to destroy the world. And it's all versions of technology is going to kill people. It's really bad. It doesn't work. And in the future, some combination of Elysium or Avatar, the Matrix movies. Maybe it's the Terminator with robots running around killing people. I watched the Gravity movie the other day. You would never want to be in outer space. I mean, you'd be so happy to be back on that muddy island with the palm trees. And I think this is sort of, I'm not blaming Hollywood. I think it simply reflects the zeitgeist of our broader society that is generally very skeptical of technological progress. And I think you can get at this. You don't want to get at this from a cultural perspective. We can sort of describe this in geopolitical terms, where if you sort of told the story of the last 2 centuries, there have been periods of globalization and periods of technology. The 19th century was a period when we had both tremendous globalization and tremendous technological progress, roughly 1815 to 1914. 1914, World War I starts. Globalization goes in reverse. There's less trade. The world becomes sort of more disconnected. Technological progress still keeps going very quickly. And then I would say, starting in the 70s, maybe I would date it to the Kissinger trip to China in 1971, globalization begins again in earnest. And the last 40 years have been an era of ferociously rapid globalization, but somewhat slower technological progress again, mostly in computers, internet, software, not so much in many other areas. And this is reflected in these very different ways we talk about the world. So in the 1950s or 1960s, the world would have been divided into the first world and the third world. The first world was that part that was technologically accelerating. The third world was that part that was sort of permanently screwed up. And today, by contrast, we would divide the world into the developed and developing countries. And this is sort of a very pro-globalization dichotomy, because the developing countries are those countries that are converging with the developed countries by copying them. And so it has sort of this homogenization, globalization, convergence of the world into sort of an essentially homogenized single planet feel to it. But it is also an anti-technological dichotomy, because when we say that we're living in the developed world, we are implicitly saying that we're living in that part of the world where nothing new is going to happen, where all the main discoveries have been made in the past, where the younger generation should be resigned to reduced expectations for the future from their parents and grandparents. And I think this is a conception of our society we should very powerfully try to resist. And so I'll end by asking the contrarian question I think needs to be asked far more often. How can we go about developing our so-called developed world? Thank you very much.